The mountains were already sinking into darkness when the first call drifted through the pines. It wasn't a cry or a scream but something far worse, gentle, coaxing, almost melodic, as though the forest itself had found a voice. Travelers who passed through Blackwood Hollow claimed the sound could slip beneath a man's ribs and settle in his bones, drawing him forward even when every instinct begged him to run the other way. Those same travelers were never seen again. By the summer of 1892, the people of Ridge Valley spoke of the Blackwood sisters only in murmurs, careful never to utter their names after sundown. No one remembered when the three feral women first appeared in the woods, or if they had ever truly left since the night their family cabin burned and their kin vanished without a trace. Some said the sisters were survivors, others swore they were something the mountains had kept hidden too long, now released into the world with unfinished hunger. Their voices, soft, eerie, and impossibly in sync, were said to drift across the hills after midnight, twining together like threads of smoke rising from a dying fire. The men who wandered toward those voices were not fools. They were loggers, hunters, railroad workers, men of grit, muscle, and hard-earned caution. Yet even the strongest found themselves stepping off the road, lanterns flickering, boots sinking into the moss-slick ground as the forest swallowed them whole. Those who remained behind blamed loneliness, drink, or misfortune, but late at night, when the wind was still and the moon hung low over the ridge, they could admit the truth: the sisters were calling, and the mountain wanted more. When the drifter arrived that October, weary and thin-shouldered, he laughed at the warnings the way young men do before they learn what fear truly is. But the hollow had been waiting for someone just like him. And on his first night under the Appalachian sky, as he lay beside the dying embers of a borrowed campfire, he heard the voices, 3 of them, weaving through the trees with a sweetness that didn't belong to anything living. The flames trembled. The wind stopped. And the woods, for the first time in years, seemed to hold their breath. The vanishing of the men began as a quiet pattern, the sort no one recognized until it had already claimed too many lives to ignore. In the early months of 1892, the Appalachian trails were busy with travelers, railroad workers seeking new camps, loggers following timber routes, drifters searching for wages or warmth before winter set in. These men were used to the dangers of the mountains, the sudden fog that swallowed whole paths, the black bears that roamed at dusk, the treacherous cliffs that gave way without warning. But what happened near Blackwood Hollow wasn't the work of nature or misstep. It was deliberate, slow, and frighteningly precise. The first disappearance was dismissed as nothing. A young surveyor named Bill Merritt left a tavern in Ridge Valley and never made it back to his quarters. Folks assumed he'd taken the wrong trail after a night of drinking. The second man, a seasoned trapper, vanished near the same stretch of woods with his pack and rifle left neatly beside a creek bed, untouched as though he had set them down and walked willingly into the trees. When the third man, a railroad foreman, disappeared on a clear morning with a full crew waiting for him just over the ridge, the town began to feel the edges of a deeper fear. Whispers spread quickly, hushed and uneasy, about soft voices heard drifting from the timber line at dusk. Men swore they had seen light movements between the trees, shadows gliding in patterns too graceful to be animal and too synchronized to be chance. Some said the missing men had been lured by someone calling to them. Others insisted the men would never have followed a stranger into the hollow, not with its reputation, not with the unease that clung to the land like fog. But every time someone tried to explain the disappearances logically, the mountains answered with another man gone, another pair of muddy boot tracks fading into nothing. By midsummer, the pattern had hardened into a grim certainty. The men who vanished were always last seen heading toward the old logging road that cut along the edge of Blackwood Hollow, a road nearly reclaimed by the forest and avoided by anyone with sense. They left no signs of struggle, no scattered belongings, no footprints leading out. It was as if the woods opened briefly to swallow them and then sealed itself again, leaving the world none the wiser. Families traveled miles to search. Posses combed the hollows with lanterns, calling the names of their lost. But the mountain kept its silence, and the darkness kept whatever it had taken, unmoved by the grief echoing through the valley. Rumors about the Blackwood sisters did not begin with the disappearances. They had been part of Appalachian folklore long before any man vanished in 1892. To the people of Ridge Valley, the sisters were less a family and more a lingering shadow, a presence the mountain tolerated but never embraced. Their parents had once been respected homesteaders who lived deep within Blackwood Hollow, far from the main trails, raising their daughters in isolation that the townsfolk found unsettling even then. After the mysterious fire that supposedly claimed the Blackwood home years earlier, the sisters were believed dead along with their parents. Yet sometimes, hunters spoke of seeing 3 figures slipping between the pines, barefoot even in winter, watching from a distance before disappearing into the undergrowth with uncanny silence. No one dared confirm what they saw, for fear of being blamed for stirring old spirits or inviting new misfortune. The rumors grew more intricate over time, layered with half-truths and fear-fed embellishments. Some claimed the sisters had never spoken like ordinary children, communicating instead through strange harmonies that echoed through the trees at dawn and dusk. Others swore they had seen the sisters kneeling around the burned remains of their family cabin years after the fire, as if performing some ritual to keep it from being reclaimed by the earth. Their eyes, people whispered, were too bright and too wild, and their movements too fluid, almost animal-like. Loners who roamed too close to the hollow spoke of being watched, feeling the weight of unseen gazes pressing into their spines until they quickened their pace out of instinct. What unsettled the townspeople most was the uncanny unity of the 3 sisters. They were always together, never seen apart, and their presence seemed to carry a kind of unnatural quiet that made the woods feel colder. The faint sing-song voices drifting through the mountains at night were attributed to them, though no one could explain how the sound carried so far or why it seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Their names were rarely spoken aloud, especially after sunset, because superstition claimed that uttering them could draw the sisters near. Even the bravest hunters refused to follow tracks leading into the deeper parts of the hollow, insisting the forest changed shape there, guiding outsiders in circles until they either fled or lost themselves completely. As the disappearances increased, the rumors hardened into chilling belief. The sisters were no longer seen as lost children or tragic survivors but as wild, feral figures bound to the forest, answering to laws no one understood. Whether they were human, spirit, or something caught uneasily between the two became a question no one wished to investigate, for the hollow had already shown what it did to those who wandered too close to its secrets. The voices began as faint echoes that only the most attentive travelers noticed, drifting from the treeline long after the mountain wind had settled. At first, men assumed the sounds were tricks of distance, maybe the last notes of a lullaby sung in a cabin miles away, or the cry of a night bird shaped strangely by the rolling hollows. But as weeks passed, those who camped near the old logging path spoke of something more deliberate in the melodies that rose from the woods. The tones were soft, almost sweet, weaving through the branches with an unsettling tenderness, as if someone were trying to soothe a restless child or coax a frightened animal closer. What disturbed listeners most was not that the voices sounded human, but that they carried a strange harmony, multiple tones rising and falling together with eerie precision. No one saw where the singing originated. Lanterns cast only shallow pools of light against the forest, and every step toward the sound made it grow fainter, as though the singers moved further with each approach. Some men claimed the voices circled them, drifting from behind one moment and then from far ahead the next, creating a sense of being followed by something unseen. Others said the voices changed subtly depending on who heard them, sometimes warmer, sometimes sadder, sometimes sharp enough to raise gooseflesh. A few insisted the harmonies included a 4th or 5th voice, low and dragging, like something trying to join the melody without understanding the rhythm. Older residents of Ridge Valley whispered that the voices were a sign the Blackwood sisters were still alive, living deep in the forest in ways no ordinary folk could survive. They believed the sisters had inherited strange gifts, or burdens, from their mother, who was rumored to have sung to the mountains themselves during storms as if calming a restless spirit. Those who remembered the family from years before claimed the sisters had always been able to match each other's voices perfectly, their harmonies so tight and uncanny that even their parents found it unsettling. To hear that same eerie synchrony floating from the woods years after their supposed deaths chilled anyone who recognized the pattern. Travelers who tried to ignore the voices found them impossible to forget. The melodies seemed to sink beneath the skin, lingering long after sunrise, replaying in the mind with a softness that made sleep restless and daylight uneasy. Some awoke certain they had heard whispers beside their tents, gentle murmurs threading through the leaves with words they almost understood. When the disappearances began, no one doubted the voices played a role, for the men who vanished were always the ones who admitted hearing the forbidden harmonies most clearly, as though the songs had singled them out and led them deeper into the waiting dark. The discovery of the first clue came on a gray morning when a seasoned hunter named Elias Turner ventured deeper into Blackwood Hollow than most dared to go. Elias was not a man easily shaken. He had spent decades tracking game through unforgiving terrain, often alone for days at a time. Yet even he felt a strange heaviness in the air as he moved through the dense pines that bordered the abandoned logging road. The forest was quieter than usual, holding its breath in a way that made the hairs on his arms lift. Birds that should have been calling at dawn were silent, and the wind felt strangely warm, as though it had passed through something hidden. Elias first noticed a disturbed patch of earth near a shallow creek, the soil darker than its surroundings as if recently overturned. Thinking it might be the work of an animal, he crouched to examine it more closely, but what he saw was too orderly, too intentional. A circle of stones had been arranged with careful precision, each one marked by long, thin scratches that looked neither natural nor made by any tool he recognized. The markings reminded him of claw trails, but they were too symmetrical, too deliberate, almost like symbols carved by a patient hand. In the center of the stone circle rested a small bundle of twigs bound tightly with a frayed strip of cloth. It was the object hanging above the circle, however, that made Elias take a step back. Suspended from a low tree branch by a length of rope was an old leather boot, weather-worn and half-collapsed from exposure. Elias knew boots, every brand, every cut, every sole common to the region. This one was unmistakable. It belonged to a drifter named Samuel Brandt, one of the first men who had gone missing weeks earlier. Samuel had passed through Ridge Valley with that very boot patched along the side, a clumsy repair job Elias remembered joking about at the general store. Seeing it now, swaying gently in the still air, made his stomach twist. The placement of the boot felt ritualistic, almost ceremonial, as if whoever had hung it wanted it to be found. Elias scanned the trees, half expecting eyes to be staring back at him, hidden among the shadows. He sensed no movement, but the silence pressed in heavier, thick enough to feel. Something was watching, he could feel it even without seeing it. He hesitated only a moment before easing the boot from the branch and stuffing it into his pack, though a part of him wished he had left it untouched. When he returned to town with the boot and word of the stone circle, the reaction was immediate and fearful. People wanted to believe it was the work of pranksters or deranged vagrants, but deep down they recognized the pattern, the deliberate intention behind it. The clue confirmed what many had feared but refused to voice: the disappearances were not accidents, not misfortune, not wilderness-claiming careless men. Someone, or something, was leaving signs behind, marking its presence, and the forest had become its silent accomplice. Strange lights appeared in the depths of Blackwood Hollow long before anyone admitted seeing them. Most who witnessed the flickering glows kept silent, fearing the ridicule that came with speaking of unnatural things. Yet as the disappearances mounted, more men began confessing in low, uneasy voices that they had glimpsed lantern-like illuminations weaving between the trees on the darkest nights. These were not the erratic sparks of fireflies or the distant glow of travelers' lamps. The lights moved with purpose, gliding smoothly across the forest floor, rising and falling in soft arcs as though carried by unseen hands. Some swore the glimmers took on a faint golden hue, while others insisted they flickered white, like cold flames burning without smoke. What disturbed those who saw the lights was not their brightness but their order. They never appeared singly; instead, they always came in threes, spaced evenly apart, drifting in synchronized patterns through the underbrush. The motions were too deliberate to be accidents of wind or reflection. One man described watching them circle a lone maple tree, their slow rotation so coordinated it reminded him of dancers moving in a silent waltz. Another claimed the lights followed him for nearly half an hour, always staying the same distance behind no matter how quickly he walked, extinguishing themselves only when he broke into a panicked run. Those familiar with the old stories of the Blackwood sisters found the sightings especially chilling. The way the lights moved, together, equal in distance, mirroring each other's pace, echoed the way hunters long ago claimed to see the sisters themselves drifting through the trees. The lights seemed to replicate their unity, that strange and unsettling bond the three young women had always shared, even before the fire that destroyed their family home. The patterns of light were too precise, too synchronized, to dismiss as coincidence. People began whispering that the sisters were using the lanterns to guide someone, or to mislead them. The more the lights appeared, the more the forest seemed to shift around them. Some travelers tried to follow the glow, believing it might lead them toward a lost hunter or a hidden cabin. But those who attempted it found the terrain unfamiliar, as though the hollow rearranged its paths the moment they stepped off the main trail. Landmarks vanished, streams seemed to run in the wrong direction, and sound carried strangely, bouncing back in echoes that felt wrong. A few returned shaken, insisting they had walked in circles despite heading in a straight line. Others never returned at all. When these accounts reached the town, even the most skeptical residents began locking their doors after dusk. They didn't need to agree on what the lights were to recognize their danger. Whether they marked warnings, invitations, or traps, they belonged to the deep woods and moved with the intelligence of something that had lived there far longer than any human presence. Sheriff Amos Greer was not a man who entertained superstition, which made his unfinished report all the more unsettling to those who later read it. For decades, Greer had patrolled the rough trails of Ridge Valley with a calm, steady presence, known for his level head even in the face of violence or wilderness accidents. He knew every ridge, every creek bend, every deer path carved into the Appalachians. So when rumors of voices and strange lights began circulating, he dismissed them as fear-fueled exaggerations. Yet duty compelled him to investigate, and one October night he set out alone toward Blackwood Hollow, armed with nothing more than his lantern, revolver, and the unwavering confidence of a man who trusted the land to behave as it always had. The sheriff's report, found later in his desk drawer, unfinished and stained with dried mud, offers the only glimpse into what happened that night. It began predictably, with Greer describing the quiet forest, the steady crunch of leaves beneath his boots, and the cool air settling across the ridges. But then the tone shifted abruptly. He wrote of hearing faint melodies drifting from deeper within the woods, soft enough to question whether they were real. At first, he believed them to be the echo of distant settlers singing hymns, but the harmonies were too precise, too intertwined, and unmistakably female. The voices rose and fell in perfect unison, weaving through the trees like threads pulled taut. Greer followed the sound, marking his trail with a hunter's instinct, scratching lines into tree bark to ensure he could retrace his steps. But with each mark he carved, the forest seemed to rearrange itself. The trees grew unfamiliar, their shapes stretching strangely in the lantern glow. His footprints vanished almost instantly, swallowed by the shifting underbrush. The sheriff noted this with growing confusion, admitting for the first time in his long career that he felt disoriented in terrain he had walked hundreds of times before. As the voices grew louder, he became aware of another sensation, an oppressive stillness that pressed against his chest, making each breath feel labored. His lantern began to dim despite a full supply of oil, and the shadows around him thickened unnaturally. He wrote that he attempted to call out, his voice cracking in a way that startled him, as if the air around him resisted sound. The final lines of the report were scribbled hurriedly, almost desperate. I tried to turn back. The trail is gone. I keep walking, but it brings me to the same place. They're singing behind me now. Closer. There were no further entries. Greer returned to town at dawn, pale and shaken, insisting he had simply lost his way in the dark. But those who saw him knew the truth. His hands trembled for days afterward, and he refused to return to the hollow. He never explained what happened, yet his unfinished report became a silent warning, one that confirmed even the sheriff himself had been drawn into whatever presence lurked within the woods. The storm that revealed the Blackwood homestead struck without warning, rolling over the Appalachian peaks with a fury that made even the oldest residents of Ridge Valley bolt their shutters in haste. Lightning split the sky in jagged white veins, illuminating the mountainsides in fractured flashes. Rain hammered the earth so violently that rivers overflowed, trees bowed under the weight of the wind, and landslides churned through forgotten hollows. It was during this chaos that the land around Blackwood Hollow shifted, peeling back layers of earth and debris that had concealed something long believed destroyed. When the storm finally broke at dawn, leaving a washed-out calm in its wake, a small group of loggers traveling the old path noticed smoke rising from a place where nothing should have been standing. Venturing closer, they discovered the old Blackwood homestead, intact, upright, and eerily preserved despite the belief that it had burned decades ago in the tragic fire that claimed the family's lives. The structure stood half-sunken into the earth, as though the forest had been slowly swallowing it but the storm had dredged it back up. Moss clung to the logs, and vines coiled like serpents around the porch posts, yet the windows remained unbroken and the roof appeared improbably sound. Even more disturbing was the faint ribbon of smoke curling from the chimney, steady and thin, as if someone inside had just stoked the fire moments before. No one dared approach the front door. The atmosphere was thick with a strange tension, an unnatural quiet that seemed to vibrate beneath the skin. Birds avoided the homestead entirely, circling above it in wide, uneasy arcs. The loggers called out, their voices echoing against the cabin walls, but no answer came, not a footstep, not a whisper, not the creak of a floorboard shifting under weight. Instead, the smoke continued to drift lazily upward, defying every claim that the cabin had been gone for years. Some of the men insisted the house looked exactly as it had in their childhood, unchanged by time, as if locked in a moment that refused to fade. Others swore it appeared older, distorted somehow, like a memory pulled from a dream and made into wood. Word spread quickly through Ridge Valley, igniting old fears and resurrecting the legends that had been reluctantly buried. If the homestead stood untouched, Then what else from the Blackwood past remained hidden in the woods? The idea that the sisters might still be living within its walls, moving in the shadows just out of sight, chilled those who heard it. The sudden appearance of the cabin suggested calculation, not chance. It felt less like a structure reclaimed by the storm and more like a secret deliberately unveiled, as though the mountains had decided it was time for the truth to resurface. Father O'Neill's return to Ridge Valley was unexpected, arriving quietly on a dim autumn afternoon when the leaves had begun to rot at their edges and the mountains seemed to exhale a weary chill. He came not as a priest on duty but as a man burdened by memories he had spent years trying to bury. Those who recognized him were startled. He had left the region decades earlier, long before the fire that supposedly ended the Blackwood family line. Time had aged him, placing deep grooves around his eyes, but nothing had dimmed the sharp worry that flickered behind them whenever the hollow was mentioned. He carried little luggage, yet something in his posture suggested he bore a weight heavier than any trunk or satchel. As a young missionary assigned to the Appalachian outskirts, O'Neill had been one of the few outsiders welcomed, even briefly, into the Blackwood home. The memory was still vivid in his mind, preserved not with warmth but with a creeping unease that had never quite left him. He remembered the parents as stern but polite, strangers to the world beyond the mountains and content to remain so. But it was the daughters, the three quiet, uncanny-eyed sisters, who had unsettled him most. They spoke rarely, often moving in perfect unison as though following a rhythm only they could hear. What haunted him was their singing. He had visited many rural families and heard countless hymns carried by mountain wind, but the harmonies the sisters produced were unlike anything human voices should have been capable of. They sang old hymns with flawless synchronicity, each note sliding seamlessly into the next, yet something in the tone felt wrong, as if the melody carried an undercurrent he couldn't name. When they sang, the forest outside the cabin would fall silent, and even their parents seemed to stiffen, as though bracing for something unseen. O'Neill left the region shortly after an incident he never fully recorded, though fragments of his recollection still clung to him. He remembered wandering into the woods one evening, guided by what he assumed was a hymn drifting from the homestead, only to find himself alone, dizzy, and miles from the path he thought he'd followed. The sound had led him deeper than he intended, and for years afterward he wondered if the sisters had meant for him to get lost or if the mountain itself had played some cruel trick. When he later learned of the Blackwood fire, he felt a strange mixture of relief and dread, though he never voiced why. News of the recent disappearances pulled him back to Ridge Valley. He arrived claiming he was merely visiting, but the locals noticed how he paused whenever someone described hearing voices in the woods. The old fear returned to his eyes, a recognition he tried to hide. He knew those harmonies. He had heard them once before, rising through the pines like a warning, like an invitation, like something that had waited all these years for a chance to begin again. The young drifter arrived in Ridge Valley just as the last of the autumn leaves clung stubbornly to the branches, his clothes worn, his boots scuffed, and his eyes carrying the quiet vigilance of someone accustomed to sleeping under open skies. He had been wandering for weeks, moving from town to town, forest to forest, seeking only shelter and a place where the wind did not bite so cruelly. The stories of Blackwood Hollow were whispered in the taverns and general stores, spoken with nervous laughter or quickly hushed, but he dismissed them as the kind of old folk tales meant to scare newcomers and keep them from wandering too far. The disappearances, the voices, the lights, the ancient cabin, all of it seemed more like superstition than threat. He wanted warmth, food, and a roof, not ghost stories to haunt his steps. On his first night in the hollow, he pitched a small camp just off the old logging road, careful to stay near the trail though the forest pressed close around him. Darkness settled quickly, thick and velvet-like, swallowing sound and making the fire appear impossibly bright against the surrounding shadows. He ate sparingly, cleaned his boots, and listened to the forest breathing. That's when he heard it, a soft, lilting sound carried on the wind, so delicate that he almost thought it was a trick of the leaves brushing together. But it did not fade, and it did not change. It was the voice of a woman, or perhaps many women, calling his name in tones that seemed to drift directly into his mind, gentle yet demanding attention. He sat frozen, heart quickening, straining to see through the thick pines. The singing drew closer with every careful breath he took, rising and falling in a strange harmony that tugged at the edges of his senses. It was not just sound but presence, something that pressed on him with an awareness he could not identify. Shadows shifted around the firelight, fleeting glimpses of movement at the periphery, and he felt eyes, hundreds, perhaps, tracking him through the darkness. The melodies wrapped around him, soft as smoke, guiding his imagination as easily as if they were pulling his body forward. His instincts screamed to flee, Yet he found his feet rooted to the spot, mesmerized, caught between fear and the irresistible allure of the sound. As the hours passed, the forest itself seemed to lean closer, branches bending as though watching, listening, waiting. The drifter realized that the voices were no accident, no casual song carried on the wind. They were deliberate, precise, and aware of his presence in a way that made the hair on his neck prickle. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep through the trees, he knew the truth that no one in Ridge Valley had ever dared to say aloud: the hollow was alive, and something inside it had chosen him. From that moment on, nothing would be the same, for the forest and its secrets had marked him, and the songs that had called him were only the beginning.